She was 12, a bright young girl, singing as she walked through the woods on a summer afternoon in 1946, and then she vanished. No one heard her song again. In that single moment, Muriel Drinkwater, carrying her school satchel and humming a tune, stepped into the shaded path home and disappeared from both life and loving memory. This wasn't just another missing girl story, it became one of Britain's oldest unsolved child cases. Nearly 8 decades later, the mystery still reverberates through the quiet valleys of Wales. Stay with me. Over the next episodes, we'll explore every clue, every investigation, every twist, and every hope that one day someone will finally answer the question, what happened to Muriel Drinkwater? It was the afternoon of the 27th of June 1946. Muriel had just stepped off her school bus, cheerful and full of hope. She had been singing on the ride home, skipping almost as she made her way along the familiar mile-long path through Penlergare Woods towards Tildew Farm, where her family lived. Her mother, Margaret, was at the kitchen window, kettle in hand, when she saw Muriel waving through the trees. That image was the last anyone saw of her alive. Moments later, she had vanished into the canopy, swallowed by silence. When Muriel didn't return as dusk fell, her parents and neighbors sprang into action. A village-wide search began under fading light, but night came with no sign of her. By the next morning, a heartbreaking discovery was made deep in the woods. Muriel's school bag and red-tailed gloves were found along the lane, abandoned, as if she'd been taken in a hurry. Then, only hours later, her body was found lying off the path, just yards from home. The cheerful song had ended, and now a hush had fallen over the woods. That quick, brutal disappearance on a familiar route under summer skies turned a normal afternoon into an enduring nightmare. The morning of the 28th of June 1946 began with a sense of dread. A police inspector, retracing the woodland path Muriel traveled, discovered her body just off the familiar route home. She lay beside a quiet clearing, no more than a few dozen paces from where her mother last saw her vanish. Authorities noted chilling details. Evidence pointed to severe head trauma and 2 bullet wounds to the chest. The killer had used a World War I-era Colt .45 pistol, a rare find in post-war Wales. Interestingly, its grip had been updated with a transparent material, suggesting it had passed through hands intent on concealment or customization. 2 days later, that same pistol was located nearby in the woods, hidden from plain view. Its discovery confirmed what investigators suspected. The weapon had been discarded deliberately, not lost accidentally. Detectives from Scotland Yard were summoned, drawn by the weapon's military connection and the somber realization that this crime was no random act, it carried planning and motive. In the heart of those Welsh trees, the scene spoke volumes. A beloved child met a planned end. The Colt .45 stood as a brutal testament to an act involving intent, calculated movement, and a deliberate attempt to cover up. And just like that, a peaceful woodland turned into a silent crime scene, one that would leave questions echoing for generations. That same evening, under a fading sky, the search for Muriel began in earnest. Villagers, her parents, and the local constable combed every inch of Penlergare Woods, calling her name into the hush. Morning light brought a chilling discovery, not just of her disappearance, but of the grim truth. By the next day, investigators from Scotland Yard had descended on Swansea. Reports poured in. More than 20,000 men across Swansea, Aberdare, and Carmarthenshire were interviewed. They methodically checked every house within 150 square miles and issued a public sketch of a man in his 30s, described as having thick, fluffy hair, a light brown sports jacket, and corduroy trousers. On the ground, clues spoke quietly yet meaningfully. Investigators found cigarette butts, sweet wrappers, and even breadcrumbs near where Muriel went missing, evidence that someone had been waiting, watching silently as she walked her usual path. Then there was Hubert Hoyles, a 13-year-old neighbor who saw her just after school and saw another man in the woods, but that man remained unidentified. Despite the scale and urgency of the operation, no one was arrested. The witness description never matched anyone conclusively. The items, cigarettes, candy would point to someone who lurked in those trees, but they also vanished into the fog of suspicion and unanswered questions. By month's end, the vast search, the wanted posters, the endless door-to-door questioning had dried up. The trail went cold, and the village that had rallied so fiercely fell silent again, grips tightened in unanswered fear, and a murder suspect walked free, hidden somewhere in plain sight. That old Colt 45 wasn't just a weapon, it was a warning sign, a rare gun in post-war Britain, especially in a quiet Welsh village. It was the kind of firearm typically issued to American soldiers during the war, not something you'd expect in the hands of someone walking woodland trails in Swansea. Even stranger, the grip had been altered. Someone had removed the standard handle and replaced it with a clear, custom material. That one detail sent a message. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was calculated, thought out, personal. Detectives believed the gun might have been brought over by a returning soldier or acquired through black market trades that flourished after the war. It wasn't traceable. No one claimed it. No one admitted to knowing anything about it. And so, even with a weapon in their hands, the police had no fingerprints, no serial number that led anywhere, and no suspect. The gun, once a hopeful lead, became just another unanswered question in a case full of silence. Days turned into weeks, and despite one of the most extensive manhunts in British history, no arrest was ever made. The public posters faded. The officers returned to London. The woods, once filled with search parties and questions, fell silent again. Muriel's family, still reeling from the loss, had to endure something even harder, not knowing who had taken her, not knowing why, and worst of all, not knowing if that person was still nearby. The Colt 45 remained in police storage, leads dried up, witness memories blurred with time, and slowly the world moved on except for the people of Penlegar who never forgot the girl with the song in her voice. For decades, the case sat untouched, folders yellowed, evidence gathered dust, and for a long time it seemed that the truth had been buried, forever lost, somewhere between the trees and time itself. It would take over 60 years for the silence to crack. In the year 2008, a cold case review team reopened Muriel's file, hoping modern science could do what old methods couldn't. They revisited the evidence, including items of her clothing that had been stored carefully since 1946. And that's when something unexpected happened. On her preserved coat, forensic scientists found a trace, a biological stain almost invisible to the eye, but still intact after all those years. From it, they were able to extract a partial DNA profile. This was a breakthrough, one of the oldest usable DNA samples ever retrieved in a British investigation. It wasn't enough for a full match, but it offered something vital, a genetic fingerprint, a starting point, and more importantly, it ruled someone out. For decades, suspicion had quietly lingered around a man named Hubert Hoyles, the last person to see Muriel alive before she disappeared. The DNA cleared him completely. After more than 6 decades of whispers, he was finally free of that shadow. For the first time in years, the case had momentum, and in that moment, science gave back a little of what time had stolen: clarity, hope, and the possibility of answers still to come. The partial DNA profile was like a match without a flame. It didn't lead directly to a suspect, but it opened the door to something new: familial DNA tracing, a technique that allows investigators to search for close relatives of an unknown person by comparing genetic markers. It's the same method that has cracked decades-old mysteries across the world. Cases once thought unsolvable have been reopened, revisited, and in some instances finally resolved because of this quiet revolution in forensic science. In Muriel's case, police began looking at potential family trees. Who had connections to the area in 1946? Who might share enough DNA to narrow the search? It's a slow process made even harder by time. People pass away, records disappear, but somewhere, perhaps a distant cousin or grandson of the person responsible might unknowingly hold the missing link. Investigators believe this may be the final hope. The DNA won't fade, science doesn't forget, and one day the truth might emerge not from a confession, but from a genetic echo passed down through generations. As investigators re-examined old files with fresh eyes, a new name began to rise from the margins: Ronnie Harries. He had lived in the area, he had worked for Muriel's father on the family farm, and years later he would be convicted of a violent crime and sentenced to death. At the time of Muriel's disappearance, Harries was not questioned. He wasn't even considered. But decades later, in a documentary re-investigating the case, former detectives and journalists began piecing together his background, and the pieces were unsettling. He had a history of disturbing behavior. He was known to act erratically, and most haunting of all, he was in the right place at the right time, with the kind of familiarity of the woods and the family routine that could have made the crime possible. No direct evidence has ever linked him to Muriel. No confession, no match. But with DNA technology advancing, and with Harry's long gone, investigators are now hoping that familial DNA might tie the story together from him or someone like him. The suspicion lingers, the timeline fits, but without concrete proof, Harry's remains one of the many question marks in a case full of shadows. A reminder that sometimes the most important suspect might be the one history almost forgot. Nearly 8 decades have passed since Muriel Drinkwater walked into the woods singing and never came home. Her case has outlived the men who searched for her, the suspects once whispered about, and even the era in which it all began. And yet one question still lingers, untouched by time: who did this to her, and why? Today, Muriel's name stands among the longest-running unsolved cases in British history. But her story is more than just a cold file. It's a legacy of perseverance, of science chasing truth, of a family and community that never gave up. Forensic technology continues to evolve. Investigators still hold hope that familial DNA or a single tip could finally break the silence. It only takes one connection, one living relative, one name from the past whispered to the right ears. Her parents never got answers. Her village was left with heartbreak. But today, with public awareness, digital records, and the determination of cold case teams, the chance for justice still exists. Because behind every unsolved case is a promise that silence will not win. That time, no matter how long, does not erase truth. And that someday someone will finally answer the question that's echoed since 1946. What happened to Muriel Drinkwater?